All right, there's David. So David Brooks is from Brazil, Indiana. And to say he's just an artist would be an understatement. To me, David is a few pages from every book in a library, one of the great free thinkers of our time, and recently recipient of the prestigious Rome Prize. David has worked to bridge the gap between many disciplines in an all hands on deck effort to protect biodiversity. David Brooks.
Thank you, everybody. My goodness, what amazingly difficult acts to follow here. But since it's not a competition, because it's Earth Day, and we actually need all of these efforts simultaneously, I will feel inspired to move on. And people like Sylvia Earle have showed me at a very young age like how to be inspired also. One of the things I'm here to do is to kind of show a little bit about maybe what artwork and what an artistic practice can bring to this conversation. I think that artists and artworks can do a lot of things that other disciplines really can't. I do really think of conservationists as some of the most avant-garde thinkers working today because of the myriad kind of topics and issues and dimensions that they have to complicate and work through and consider. And an artwork, though, an artistic practice can do a number of other things that maybe others can. It can bring in elements of empathy. It can bring in elements of humor, contradiction, elements even of like wonder, curiosity, maybe even irrationality. An artistic practice can hold two contradictory elements together at the same time for us to be able to experience it. And that element is really of bearing witness, I think. I think of it as bearing witness to what is unfolding within us at this moment. And in terms of thinking around hope, I have three or four projects here I'm going to just kind of walk you through that I've done that are artistic projects. And Rebecca Solnit has said around the notion of hope that because I think that many of us are often feeling kind of immobilized or paralyzed by the sheer daunting scale of the issues that we face on a daily basis, but that difficult is not the same as impossible. And so I think also that all of you have shown thus far really like how, what you're doing is very difficult, but it's not impossible. And I think that's a very important thing. Me as an artist, I kind of started really young, going to places. Yes, I was from Brazil, Indiana, but I've spent so much of my time in places like South Florida and throughout South America. And like this is in the Everglades, trudging through the Everglades, doing citizen science type things that I can participate in, the Audubon bird counts, the census projects around that, various types of biodiversity surveys, especially with Dr. Nathan Lujan, who you'll hear from after me. Including various types of field work, but also it really to kind of show, for me, it's important to really be there in the moment in order to see that, first of all, what the process of the scientific generating of our knowledge base looks like, what it feels like, but also to kind of see that these are our non-humans that we share the earth with are not just statistics and data, but they are real living, breathing beings. And that also what an artist can perhaps do is kind of show their affection for our fellow non-humans as well, as we did here in our fish tagging program. But one of the things that I think can also begin to generate a sense of hope, interestingly and weirdly, and maybe contradictory in some ways, is actually a sense is developing or is expanding our sense of mourning and how to mourn something so that we're not paralyzed by it and that we can move forward. And so one project I'm going to show you here, which is all of these projects I'm showing you are kind of ongoing projects because as an artist, I'm not just making one thing and place it in a gallery and I'm done. It's sort of like instigating a gesture of sorts. So I had, in the various years of going to South America throughout the Amazon basin with Nathan Lujan, kind of seeing the scale and the speed of deforestation is something that to really grapple with and to kind of come to terms with in some sense. And it really felt like as I'm seeing these large swaths of forests, it's kind of removed, deforested often through fossil fuel extraction here, like an oil pad, through, of course, soy cultivation, grazing cattle, even gold mining processes, and so various forms of extraction, resource extraction. It felt like a friend was being taken away, that a friend was passing. And so I wanted, it almost felt like a mentor of mine. I actually, when she passed away, I made a death mask of her, and her name was Urzy Schwartz from New Orleans. She used to actually make her living when she was in her 30s, making death masks for various people. And it's a way to kind of, and very much in the New Orleans tradition, it's a way of also accepting death so we can move forward and focus on life. And so what I had done is that over the years of going down to South America and seeing these sections of forest that were about to be cut down for various reasons, and they're really unique, irreplaceable kind of sites of flora and fauna. And I wanted to capture them before that moment happened. So here, just showing the drone that I used to kind of do a 3D scan of the landscape, making it into then a 3D model, and then from the 3D model, a 3D print, which is a corn-based polymer, which then allowed me to then do a ceramic shell process in a foundry, where here we're pouring aluminum into the ceramic shell, but then allowing it to overfill and spill out. So these, what I'm calling death masks, are really these kind of almost, I think of them like fingerprints. It's like taking a real snapshot of this place, almost like a fingerprint, and letting it or kind of fossilizing it or crystallizing it into this aluminum material that will last, you know, and arguably for thousands of years, but we don't actually know if that's true yet. Each of these pieces then has the GPS coordinates stamped onto the aluminum so that a future generation can go to that same site and see what was once there. The overflow of the aluminum, as you see kind of spilling off from them, is a way to kind of show that they maybe are, it has a sense almost of the forests are melting in some sense, but it also might be that there's a creation of another landscape, or this idea of a mark being made in that moment, like a paint mark or something spilling. And so there's a number of these that have been done already, and I think of them also as kind of an archive or a building library, hopefully a library that won't get too full. Next to each one of these, then I always show these looped 3D monitors, which are just the couple of minutes of drone video footage that are actually used to sculpt the actual form that you see before you. And so it's almost that it also giving access to a perspective or an access into the process. Again, so it's not an act of like magic and voila, but actually sort of like we can see and witness these things. Again, another aspect of bearing witness, which I think is very important. Another one here is the GPS coordinates kind of stamped in, and this idea, this very dramatic lighting. They're on the floor, so we look down at them almost like one might look at a Google map or Google Earth kind of view of the space. Thinking about that though, about the future generations, this idea of thinking outside of one's own lifespan has become a really important component of how I think about art making. And so at Storm King, which is a large sculpture park about an hour north of New York City in the Hudson Valley, which is kind of really famous for these large, big painted metal sculptures that you can speed by on the New York Thruway at 70 miles an hour and take in the art real quick. But I wanted to kind of do a different approach with my project that I did there. And that's where I went around the perimeter of the site. This is a map showing the site. It's about 400 acres, the site. And so I went into the kind of unmanicured wooded areas of the site and chose just really ephemeral situations, maybe just the way these sticks kind of overlay each other, just had a sculptural kind of quality that spoke to me. And it was really just taking a walk along that outer trail and finding situations that just simply spoke to me. And then I would make a bronze cast of that exact situation. And then they get set permanently affixed. There's 3 feet of concrete below this one bronze on the right. So they're affixed there kind of forever. And so the idea is that over time, these various castings of the bronze would actually fold into the landscape over time. Here's just kind of parts of the process. And here's setting this one into the concrete. And here you can imagine this, if this was some already 4 years ago, you can imagine the piece on the right is long decomposed and gone, but the bronze is still with us. Here, a deer skeleton, which has become one of the visitors' favorites, a slab of bark. Some of these still do remain, and you can kind of go back over time and see the process of decay or entropy, this idea that things do change and transform over time. One of the things, though, for me that really is the biggest art part of this project was the legal agreement that I made with Storm King. And that is that they had to put into language about that they stay forever and that they can't manicure them and that they get folded into the landscape. So the idea of folding the notion of foreverness into legal language is very complicated. That contract took about a year in order to go back and forth and find the language that made sense, that it's a sculpture park. So it's, you know, when something, if a tree falls on something or if it gets dirt on it or whatever it may be, they want to go and clean it and give it a nice polish again. But for this project, I kind of mandated that they don't touch anything. And in fact, some of these out of the 30 of them are already kind of being buried under the landscape. So the idea is that there's sort of also a time capsule. For some of them, they are actual plant and tree species that maybe won't even exist a couple hundred years from now. And so there's some future generation that will find them perhaps buried in the landscape, hopefully not because they're excavating to make a condominium building there, but maybe, and if they do, there will be a stamped number on them that corresponds with an archive that's part of the Storm King collection. Part of this also, I would say, this again, this notion of bearing witness and thinking outside of one's lifespan is that a person comes to the quietude of this perimeter in the woods, and they're kind of reconciling with these two notions because it's part of the signage and didactics around that these are there forever. And so they're kind of thinking about this really quiet moment in the woods, this object is kind of there forever, thinking into the future outside of your lifespan. And that's just, for me, a very expansive, generative element that, in my feeling, kind of expands our sense of accountability and responsibility into future generations, much like all of the other conservationists that are speaking today are doing in their own work. This other project really is really literally generative and for the non-humans. That is this project called the Budding Bird Blind. And again, it's ongoing, as all these projects are. And it was an inaugural project for this a state park and foundation called Planting Fields, which is in Oyster Bay of Long Island, just past New York City. And it's the Friedrich Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park. It was actually his sons that designed this landscape. But it has areas that I feel really needed expanding. And so especially in a time when we have such massive habitat loss and over-harvesting, over-hunting of species, you know, but also in a moment in terms of birds, as many mentioned, even Sylvia Earle mentioned earlier, like just the sheer increase of enthusiasm around something like bird watching. I think many of us maybe saw our neighbors pick up bird watching during the COVID shutdown. And so this was an opportunity I found where we can kind of use this landscape to, in a sense of enthusiasm, to expand on that. So I made a bird blind. These are just some reference images of what a bird blind might be for those that might not know. It's just like a structure that you can view the non-humans, the nature through without disturbing them. But I wanted to use this excuse of a sculpture or this moment of a sculpture as an excuse to actually expand the forest edge. And so what I had done is we'd planted around 30 of these trees. We had relocated some of them from a denser part of the forest where they would not be able to kind of thrive, and brought them here and planted other ones. And then built the structure of our bird blind around it. It's a Tudor revival style structure that kind of mimics a neighboring building on the property. And the trees perforate through it, of course. So one kind of sees this play, the life of the tree playing out in relationship with the bird blind. And it changes, of course, over time. And there's kind of this integration with things, also this notion of this kind of making quite physical how we are completely interrelated and interconnected. And also, of course, giving a place for one to be able to sit and to observe our birds and our other non-humans at the moment. But part of the project also, and the thinking, was that this would also be a sculpture that would change over time. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And that is that as the trees grow in, of course, they're going to need expansion, and they're going to need the structure itself to kind of be diminished in some way. So we have this kind of 12-year plan of taking bigger and bigger sections of the structure away as the trees grow in and become more of a mature forest. But eventually, what we're left with is an expansion of the forest, but with all bird attractive tree species. And a view of those inside the gallery. I've already gone back just recently and extracted some of the bigger sections of there. And since that was a project that was 2 years ago, there's these teenagers that came by this last week when I was out there, and they had just kind of remarked about how they've been coming every couple of months for the last 2 years and really seeing it change. And they didn't quite understand it was an artwork at first. And then once they realized some months ago that it was a very inspiring moment for them. And so also seeing this youth kind of grow up around it and witnessing the change of it has been also very generative for me. And then the last piece I'm going to show you, because as I'm talking about this act of mourning, another one about expanding a sense of accountability or responsibility into the future. Two, that of being created an artwork that can actually be generative, like I just showed you in the last one, and actually generate a landscape. This one also, which is a project that is generative in some sense, and has kind of brings two grappling contradictory elements into one. So here in South Florida, this is a very common scene here. This is a reference image, a very common typical scene in South Florida of just constant ongoing construction and development. But also this is what is not necessarily always seen, which is right off the shorelines in South Florida of bycatch and overfishing. And so both formally in terms of the gridded forms that we see in the net here, but also one here that is being constructed, and here this one is going through an act of destruction. I'm going to kind of bring those two together. And so the site where I was working with, this is part of a project called the Commuter Biennial. And the Commuter Biennial was the artworks that were commissioned specifically only for commuters to be able to see. And so here, this is for those that might know Miami, this is the 836 or Dolphin Expressway that runs right by the airport. That's the Miami airport right on the top there. And that's the Blue Lagoon down below, which was it's a lagoon that was excavated for the making of the airport itself. And so it's a very barren kind of land. So here I have this kind of wild structure, which is both a combination of a housing structure, but also this kind of writhing of fish within it that has a kind of element of the nets being catching the fish in some regard. Only visible though from the highway as one passes by. So for the couple of months that it was up, it had this really interesting kind of hilarious social media presence where people were naming this thing. They had no idea what this was. They were doing circles around the highway to come back around and try and look at like, what is this thing? And there was a term in Spanish that was being hashtagged around this, which basically translates like to the strange something nothing. Part of this project though, so it was to one, have a spectacle for people to see and to bring these two visual ideas and conceptual ideas together in a way. And at the same time though, it was made with a friend who works on coral restoration. So we made this out of materials that will last, actually specifically to then sink it and to become a coral reef and become armatures for the growth of coral underwater. So in this sense, I see like this, it is a gift, but it's also giving a sense of possibility, but one that we won't necessarily be able to see. So it's almost like art for the fish in some manner, but also one that just simply allows an act of growth to take place. So those are just a couple of projects I wanted to share with you all. And I think that, one of the things I often say is that I know that an art project sometimes might feel like a drop in the bucket in regards to the state and the sheer inhuman scale of this human derived kind of issues and problems and crisis. But, buckets are still made of drops. And so I would say that we actually need as many drops as we can, and that and an artistic practice, I think, can help kind of begin to fill some of those drops. So I'll leave it there, and thank you all so much. What a pleasure to be on with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Do you want to just say a few words about Art of the Expedition? They're gonna view that next.
Yeah. Sure. So this is a film by Ivy Yin, and it's Ivy has accompanied a couple of expeditions, biodiversity surveys, led by Nathan Lujan, who you'll hear from right after the film. And there's an element around putting together an expedition, which is it's very complicated, and there is kind of an art to it, which is kind of bringing many different people together, working extremely locally, working with the very people that live in these places. These are two expeditions that are specifically in the Amazon basin. One's in Ecuador and one was in Peru. I've been accompanying Nathan Lujan since 2005 on a various number of these expeditions all around the Amazonian basin, usually around the kind of rim of the Amazonian basin, where a lot of speciation really takes place. And for me, as an artist, it's a place where you can really see, almost get a roadmap as to how evolution works, both in terms of watching Nathan and the scientists work, also participating in it and kind of being really present, bearing witness again. And kind of thinking through, as I said before, like that I see conservationists and biologists as some of the really most avant-garde thinkers today, because they really are grappling with so many different dimensions and issues at one moment. And so for me, it's always an important aspect for me not to just read about statistics or what's happening with these issues, but actually to be there and be present. So Ivy accompanied us on a couple of these expeditions in the last years and put together this film, which is sort of a look, a lot at Nathan Lujan, but also giving a kind of humanness to the scientific process, and also that an artist like myself can play a role in that as well.
Ah, sí, qué bueno.
Vive ahí en la reina.
¿Ya lo ves?
Tiene que arrastrar la reina.
La reina.
Sí. Este es un adulto. Vive en la reina.
The Rio Ambiacu. The diversity of life here is mind-blowing even for somebody like me who studied fish diversity in the Amazon for over 20 years. We've been working very hard looking at every available habitat, trying to collect as many different species as possible, and what we found has really been astounding. This collection that we've made is particularly important because it's the first large collection of genetic samples from this basin. And genetic samples are especially important because today the science of biodiversity is largely based on DNA. Everything that we do is based on genetic relationships, and that's an important focus of conservation, not just protecting species as units, but also protecting the genetic diversity that underlie those species. Emmanuel Newhouse from Brazil. Emmanuel has discovered several new species to science. His PhD focused on a group of South American catfishes in the genus Ancestris. So these are known as bristle-nosed catfishes. They're popular in the ornamental fish trade. They're really charismatic, kind of birds of paradise of neotropical rivers, with these flamboyant tentacles out of the snout and these big hooks out of the cheek. Although they're really a charismatic, engaging group, their taxonomy is really poorly understood. And Emmanuel and I have struggled with the taxonomy of Peruvian Ancestris for several years. And this has been visiting the Ambiacu and collecting these type localities here has been a stumbling block for our project. So that was one of the main motivating factors for this trip, was to come here and collect these 150-year-old species, that by observing them, clarifying their definition, and then by clarifying that definition, allowing us to describe new species from throughout Peru. So Emmanuel has discovered several new species in this genus Ancestris and is working on a molecular phylogeny that puts all of the species in the genus into a tree of life, if you will, kind of a model of evolutionary relationships. And that opens up a lot of corridors for research into the origins of this biodiversity and the factors required to maintain that biodiversity over long timescales.
As we're seeing this acceleration of a multitude of crises around the world from an ecological, environmental standpoint, the need for artists working with scientists, though it's an old method, becomes ever more important. Science may show us what to care about, but not necessarily show us how to care about it. And so the artistic practice can come in, and artists can take what the scientist is doing and the information that is expanding our knowledge base and create and fill out the full human story around it as to why we need to care about this.
Tell me a little bit about David Brooks.
Well, what can I say about David Brooks? There is an art to the expedition, and that art is a critical kind of central component to everything that we're doing. We first met in the Casiquiare Canal in southern Venezuela, and David provides a unique perspective on kind of a holistic thinking of biodiversity. So I'm very much focused on fish diversity and these scientific questions of taxonomy, of evolution and ecology. And David's often thinking more holistically about the ecosystem as a whole, contemporary concerns about conservation, and ways of conveying those concepts in a non-traditional means. So whereas I'm conveying knowledge via a scientific method, via hypothesis development and hypothesis testing, he has a variety of tools available to him to convey a distinct perspective on truth in this ecosystem that has so many different dimensions to it.
Nathan Lujan has had a remarkable number of species new to science that he's described. Already at this point in his career, a total of 42 species new to science. So I'm more of a skateboarder. In terms of comparing Dr. Lujan to an athlete, I would liken him to the famous skater from the 80s and 90s, Mark Gonzalez. Mark Gonzalez was a well-known street skater. He actually invented the form of modern-day street skating, where he's looking at, say, like a a parking block or a parking curb or a staircase or a handrail or a bench and rethinking what it can mean. If you almost think about that as a species and rethinking or redescribing or revising what that means as a species in relationship to this larger kind of urban landscape. So and they can think of that as the ecology in a way. So in a way, there's like this relationship between the individual species and the ecology that I see in this innovative skater like Mark Gonzalez in relationship to Dr. Lujan. The clock is really ticking. As we're witnessing multiple environmental and climate crises around the world, we realize that this is a multi-pronged problem and it doesn't discriminate against anybody. And these are not issues that can be addressed or resolved from a single discipline or a single person. They can only be addressed collaboratively. And so it's the notion of collaboration and the support for collaboration becomes increasingly more important just as our crises are becoming more and more severe.